The weight of the town pressed against me like a physical force, an invisible hand squeezing my chest tighter with every step. It wasn't just the whispered rumors or the cold stares, it was something deeper, a pervasive silence that spoke volumes in its absence. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something inevitable and terrible. Inside my own mind, the walls were crumbling. Each day, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolved a little more, leaving me stranded in a shifting labyrinth of shadows and doubt. I lay awake for hours, staring at the cracked ceiling of my room, the faint hum of the town's distant life a broken lullaby. Outside, the wind clawed at the eaves like a desperate thing seeking entry, and somewhere beyond, a dog barked, a sharp, frantic sound that shattered the night's fragile calm. My thoughts spiraled, circling the same dark questions I had no answers to. What had I become? How had the forest changed me? And why did the town seem so desperate to keep me at arm's length, as if I were poison? Faces haunted me, glimpses in passing windows, strangers whose eyes flickered with unspoken knowledge. I saw them everywhere, in every crowd, every shadow. They watched, waited. I could feel their judgment like a cold weight pressing against my skin. The mirror became my enemy. Each reflection distorted, twisting my features into something grotesque and alien. Some nights, I barely recognized the hollow-eyed figure staring back, the skin pale and stretched too tight over bones that seemed to pulse with dark energy. I tried to cling to fragments of who I was, the childhood memories, the moments of laughter and warmth, but they slipped through my fingers like smoke, dissolving into the creeping blackness. At times, I felt the forest's breath against my neck, the whisper of its ancient language curling around my thoughts like a serpent's tongue. It promised power, release, and something infinitely worse, submission. One evening, I wandered the streets under a heavy sky swollen with rain. The town was nearly deserted, the flickering street lamps casting twisted shadows that danced like specters. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the slow drip of water from gutters. As I passed an alley, a sudden movement caught my eye, a figure slinking just out of the light, watching me with gleaming eyes that shone like cold coals. I froze, heart pounding, but when I blinked, it was gone. Only the echo of its presence lingered, a dark pulse in the marrow of my bones. The townsfolk's whispered rumors took on new weight. They said the forest took more than just children, it took pieces of the soul, fragments of the mind that could never be reclaimed. I felt that loss gnawing at me, a slow erosion of my very self. I began to hear voices, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, then clearer, more insistent. They spoke in riddles and half-truths, pulling at the edges of my sanity. "Join us," they murmured. "Let go. Remember." I resisted, but the battle was exhausting. Each day, the lines blurred further. Sleep became a tenuous refuge, yet dreams brought no peace. Only the forest's ever-watchful eyes and the echo of children's laughter twisted into cruel mockery. In those moments, I questioned my own mind. Was I losing grip on reality, or was reality itself unraveling around me? The town felt like a living wound, bleeding shadows into my veins. I was both prisoner and prey, caught in a web spun by forces I could neither see nor fight. And deep inside, a part of me began to surrender, reaching out for the darkness that promised escape. Even if that escape meant losing myself forever. The town was a patchwork of cracked facades and whispered lies, its smiling faces masks stretched thin over something far older and far more sinister. I had walked these streets for weeks, feeling the invisible eyes lurking behind curtained windows and the shifting shadows beneath flickering street lamps. But only now, as my mind splintered further, did the hidden pulse of the place begin to thrum beneath the surface of my awareness. It started with small things, an overheard conversation clipped too quickly, a door slammed shut as I approached, glances that didn't quite meet mine. The way the children all seemed to vanish from sight the moment I turned the corner. The way the old men gathered in the square, their faces unreadable, murmuring words that vanished when I drew near. One evening, wandering aimlessly to escape the growing storm inside me, I found myself outside the town's library. A low, squat building that smelled of dust and forgotten time. I pushed open the heavy door, and the musty air greeted me like a shroud. Rows of books stretched into shadow, but it was not the dusty tomes that caught my attention. It was the walls. Patterns carved faintly into the plaster, spiraling glyphs that seemed to shift under the flickering candlelight. I pressed my palm against the rough surface, and a cold shiver ran down my spine, as if the walls themselves breathed beneath my touch. I found a book, ancient and bound in cracked leather, tucked away in a forgotten corner. Its pages were yellowed, edges frayed, but the words inside pulsed with a dark vitality. They spoke of the forest, its hunger, its pact with the land, and the price paid in blood and silence. The more I read, the more the town's familiar streets twisted into something alien, a place built on ritual and sacrifice hidden beneath the veneer of everyday life. At night, the whispers returned, stronger now, threading through my dreams with a cruel insistence. They spoke of an ancient covenant, sealed long ago between the town's founders and the forest's dark heart, a promise of protection in exchange for a yearly toll. Children. I tried to tell myself it was madness, the product of my fractured mind and sleepless nights. But then came the signs. The carved symbols left etched into the bark of trees just beyond town. Fresh and bleeding sap like open wounds. The faint scent of smoke and burning incense wafting through the streets when no one was near. And the faces. I began to notice the same few townsfolk appearing at odd hours, silhouettes slipping between buildings, murmuring in the shadows. Their eyes gleamed with a fevered intensity that sent chills through me, a silent congregation bound by secrets too terrible to speak aloud. One afternoon, I caught sight of a strange figure standing near the edge of the forest. Cloaked in dark robes, their face hidden beneath a hood, they raised a hand in greeting, or was it a warning? I stumbled backward, heart pounding as the figure vanished into the trees like smoke. Back in the confines of my room, the walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thickening with the scent of earth and decay. My reflection no longer resembled me. The eyes staring back were hollow, haunted by a knowledge I did not want. The line between the town's shadows and my own fractured mind blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Every whispered rumor, every secret glance, every carved symbol chipped away at what remained of my sanity. The town was not just a place. It was a living organism, breathing, watching, feeding. And I was trapped inside its thrumming heart. In the depths of my unraveling, I realized the forest's grasp was mirrored in the town itself, a web of control and silence, woven over generations. The disappearances were only the surface. Beneath lay something far darker, a ritualized terror that seeped into the soil and the souls of those who lived here. And I was becoming part of it. The history of the town was written in whispers and shadows, a tapestry of half-forgotten events stitched with silence. No one talked about it openly. The older residents averted their eyes, and the younger ones simply didn't ask. But I was desperate to understand, to unravel the tangled roots of the darkness that clawed at my mind. In the dusty archives of the library, I found brittle newspapers, faded photographs, and handwritten journals tucked away in a locked cabinet that seemed to resist my touch. After days of searching, I pried open a small, leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked and fragile. Inside were entries that chilled me to my core. The town was founded centuries ago, on the edge of the vast, ancient forest, a place no one dared enter for fear of vanishing. The earliest settlers spoke of the forest as a living entity, a guardian and a devourer. Their journals described strange rituals, nightly ceremonies held at the forest's edge to appease an unseen force they called the Root, a name whispered with reverence and terror. The records told of the taking. The first documented disappearance. A child, barely more than a toddler, vanished into the trees during the height of summer. The settlers believed the forest demanded a sacrifice, a price to keep the town safe. Each year thereafter, one child would disappear, and after a full cycle of seasons, another child would return, but never quite the same. I uncovered photographs showing the children who returned, their eyes glassy, their faces pale, etched with shadows that no sunlight could wash away. Local folklore called them the returned, but the truth behind their vacant stares was far darker than any tale could capture. One diary, penned by a woman named Margaret, a midwife who lived 2 centuries ago, described the rituals in terrifying detail. She wrote of masked figures chanting beneath the moon, blood offerings carved into the earth, and a pact sealed in blood and bone. She described the forest as a living god that demanded obedience, a sentient force that bound the town in chains invisible but unbreakable. The deeper I delved, the more the line between myth and reality blurred. I learned that the town's founders had forged an unholy alliance with the forest's dark heart, promising eternal protection in exchange for obedience and sacrifice. Over the centuries, that pact became law, enforced by silence, fear, and the whispered terror that gripped every family. The ledger ended abruptly, with the final entry stained in dried crimson. The words beneath the blot read, "The root grows. The debt is never paid. The hunger never ends." My hands trembled as I closed the book. The past was not dead, it was alive, bleeding into the present with claws sharp enough to tear flesh and mind alike. I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me, the endless cycle of sacrifice, the shadow of the forest stretching its tendrils through time, through bloodlines, and now, through me. Outside, the wind howled like a mourning spirit, and the trees beyond the town whispered in voices older than memory. The past had awoken, and it was hungry. The weight of the past wasn't something I could ignore, it clung to my skin like a second, rotting layer. The ledger's final words echoed in my mind, "The root grows. The debt is never paid. The hunger never ends." I felt as if those words had been carved directly into my flesh, bleeding with a cold that seeped into my bones. I knew then that I couldn't simply walk away. This town, this forest, had chosen me, whether I wanted it or not. The truth had burrowed its claws deep, and if I didn't face it, it would consume me entirely. The next morning, I sought out the oldest resident I could find, a woman named Elsie, rumored to have lived in the town her entire life. Her skin was like cracked parchment, her eyes cloudy but sharp with knowledge. When I knocked on her weathered door, a scent of dried herbs and something faintly metallic hung in the air. She didn't ask who I was or why I'd come. Instead, she stared at me as if peering through my very soul, then nodded slowly. "You've seen the ledger," she said, voice low, rough like gravel. I nodded, unable to find my own voice. Elsie beckoned me inside. The room was dim, filled with strange trinkets, dried flowers tied with red thread, carved wooden talismans, and a shallow bowl of dark water that seemed to ripple despite still air. A faint smoke curled from a smoldering bundle of sage. "Most don't want to know," she said, settling into a creaking chair. "But knowing is the first step. The forest isn't just trees and soil. It's a hunger, old as time. The pact was made to protect the town, but it's a prison, too." I listened, every word sinking in like poison and balm all at once. Elsie told me about the ritual nights, the sacrifices, the chants in an ancient tongue that twisted your mind just to hear them. How the town's leaders, chosen by the forest itself, carried the burden of keeping the pact alive. How families had been broken, children taken, and lives twisted beyond recognition. "The returned are not the same," she whispered. "They carry the forest's shadow inside them. They see things no one else can, hear voices that no one else hears." I felt a cold shudder race down my spine. She looked at me, her cloudy eyes piercing. "You felt it, haven't you? The whispers in your mind, the eyes in the dark." I nodded again, helpless. Elsie handed me a worn, hand-stitched cloth, a talisman she said would offer some protection, a fragile barrier against the forest's reach. "It won't keep you safe forever," she warned, "but it might buy you time." Leaving her house, the sky had turned a bruised purple, the wind tugging at my clothes like the forest itself was reaching for me. Every shadow seemed alive, every breeze whispered secrets. That night, I sat alone in my room, clutching the talisman, but the forest's hunger gnawed at my thoughts. The boundaries of my mind thinned until I wasn't sure where I ended and the shadows began. Memories flickered, some mine, some stolen like fragments from the returned. Faces, places, feelings not my own, bleeding through the cracks. I realized then that the forest's grasp was not just outside. It was inside me, rooted deep in my mind, twisting my thoughts, pulling me towards something I both feared and ached for. I wasn't just confronting the town's past. I was confronting my own unraveling. The roots had found me. The talisman lay heavy in my palm, but it felt like a token of fragile hope, barely holding back a tide that threatened to drown me whole. That night, the forest stopped being just a place outside my window. It slipped inside me, a slow rut burrowing beneath my skin, twisting my thoughts until they were tangled vines strangling what was left of my sanity. I tried to hold on to what was real, the feel of the rough wooden floor beneath my bare feet, the faint hum of the town beyond the cracked window, the rhythm of my own breathing. But even these simple anchors fractured under the weight of creeping dread. At first, the whispers were faint, barely audible beneath the white noise of my mind. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to coil just beyond the edge of hearing, promises, warnings, riddles I couldn't grasp but felt burning beneath my skin. They seeped into my dreams, turning them into landscapes of shifting shadows and impossible shapes. I would wake in the dark, heart pounding, gasping for air as unseen fingers pressed against my temples, squeezing. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps pacing outside my door, slow and deliberate, but when I looked, nothing was there. Only the heavy, choking silence. The boundaries between what was me and what was not blurred further every hour. Sometimes I would catch myself murmuring words I didn't recognize, ancient syllables curling off my tongue like smoke. Other times, my own reflection in the mirror stared back at me with eyes that weren't quite mine, darker, hollowed, as if the forest's shadow had seeped into my very soul. The memories began to warp. Faces merged into grotesque masks, events twisted into cruel parodies of themselves. I remembered laughing with old friends, but the echoes sounded hollow, like the laughter of ghosts trapped beneath the earth. I tried to call out, but my voice came back distorted, my own mind turning against me, mocking my desperation. Paranoia bloomed like a cancer. I was certain the townsfolk watched me with something like pity, or worse, calculation. Their smiles never reached their eyes. When I crossed paths with children, their gazes held a hollow stillness that chilled me to the bone, as if they were windows to some dark abyss I could not face. Sleep became a battleground. Every attempt to close my eyes summoned twisted visions, the forest bleeding shadows, roots writhing beneath the soil like serpents, hands reaching out from the earth, grasping for me, faces without eyes whispering secrets too terrible to speak aloud. I screamed silently, trapped beneath layers of dream and nightmare. During the day, the lines between reality and hallucination thinned dangerously. The forest seemed to press against the town's edges, creeping in like black smoke curling around houses, turning windows into dark, empty eyes watching me. I felt my mind fracturing, shards of identity splintering and scattering into the wind. Sometimes I was me, frightened, exhausted, clinging to what little hope remained. Other times, I felt a cold calmness, a voice inside that whispered of surrender and belonging, urging me to let go, to become part of the endless cycle. The forest was not just a place, it was a force, a presence, a living shadow inside my skull, gnawing at the last threads of myself. I was trapped in a labyrinth of my own unraveling, hunted by ghosts of the past and the monstrous hunger of the roots beneath the earth. In the mirror, I caught a flicker. My reflection didn't quite mimic my movements. It smiled when I did not. It whispered when I was silent. It was a dark twin, a specter born of the forest's hunger, waiting patiently to consume me whole. I am losing myself, piece by agonizing piece. There was a moment, a razor-thin, almost cruelly brief moment, when the fog in my mind lifted. The cacophony of whispers stilled. The shadow in the mirror paused its cruel mimicry. For an instant, I was myself. Not fractured, not haunted, not a vessel for something ancient and hungry. I was sitting by the window, the first light of dawn spilling weakly over the jagged outline of the forest. The world outside felt startlingly real. The weight of the talisman in my hand was tangible, grounding. My breath came slow and even. The pounding ache in my skull quieted, and I could think clearly, if only for a moment. I realized I was not just a victim of the forest's hunger, but a witness to something far older, far darker. This was not just about the disappeared children, or the returned, or the pact. It was about the very fabric of reality here, thin, fraying, vulnerable to tearing. The town was a surface, a fragile veneer stretched over something monstrous beneath. The forest was not just a place of trees, but a prison for something ancient, something that had seeped into the roots of the earth and the minds of those who lived here for generations. I felt something stir inside me, a pulse of recognition, as if part of me had always known this truth but buried it deep beneath layers of denial and fear. But then, just as quickly as it came, the clarity shattered. A cold wind whipped through the cracked window, carrying with it a scent like iron and rot. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, crawling along the walls like living things. The whispering returned, hissing now, urgent and desperate. The reflection in the glass warped grotesquely. My own face twisted and melted into something terrible, a mask of roots and bone, eyes burning with a hunger that was no longer mine alone. I realized then that the forest wasn't just outside or inside me, it was both, a parasite feeding on my mind, growing stronger whenever I dared to resist. That moment of clarity was a trap, a cruel joke designed to break me, to lure me deeper into the labyrinth of madness. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat tightened, the air vanished from my lungs as if the forest itself was strangling me. The talisman slipped from my grasp, falling to the floor with a dull thud that echoed like a death knell. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the shadowed figure of a child standing just beyond the forest's edge. Eyes empty, mouth curved in a smile too wide, too sharp. And then, silence. When I came back to myself, it was as if I had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, scattered across a barren wasteland inside my own mind. The darkness that swallowed me was no longer some distant threat, it had taken residence within, a relentless presence gnawing at my very core. My breath came in ragged gasps. The room around me was unchanged, yet every detail felt warped, uncanny, as if reality itself had frayed at the edges. The walls seemed to pulse softly, breathing in time with my heartbeat, alive and watching. Shadows pooled in corners like ink spilled on paper, thick and waiting. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled beneath me, as though they belonged to someone else. A cold sweat clung to my skin, and every nerve screamed with a sensation I couldn't name. A raw, aching dread that was not just fear, but something older and deeper. The talisman lay broken on the floor, its threads unraveling like the fragile defenses of my mind. I reached out but recoiled. The moment my fingers brushed the frayed cloth, I felt a sudden pulse of pain, a jolt that shot through my skull and dragged me back into the darkness. The whispering had returned, but it was different now. No longer distant murmurs, they were sharp, invasive. Voices clawing at the walls of my mind, slipping through cracks I didn't know existed. Some were familiar, twisted echoes of my own thoughts, others were alien, guttural and cruel, promising release and damnation in the same breath. I saw faces in the shadows, some flickering like distant memories, others monstrous and distorted. They whispered my name, calling me deeper into the forest's hungry embrace. Their eyes glowed faintly, pulling me toward a truth I was desperate to deny. The line between past and present blurred until I could no longer tell if I was awake or trapped in a waking nightmare. Memories, both mine and others, flooded my mind like a rising tide. Faces of children, lost and found, pain and hunger etched into their expressions. A mother's scream echoed through time, mingling with the rustling leaves outside. I became certain the town itself was a labyrinth, not just of streets but of memories and horrors layered like sediment. Every step I took outside felt like walking through a waking tomb, the eyes of the returned following me, their silence louder than any scream. My reflection haunted me still, but now it was fractured, splintered shards of a self I could barely recognize. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of something else behind my eyes, something ancient and hungry watching patiently, waiting for me to surrender. Sleep was a forgotten realm. Each attempt to close my eyes unleashed new terrors. Visions of the forest bleeding into the town, roots bursting through cracked sidewalks, twisting around the legs of oblivious townsfolk. I was both spectator and prisoner, trapped in a waking dream that dissolved the boundaries of my sanity. I tried to speak to others, to find help, but my words felt foreign, clumsy, swallowed by a fog no one else seemed to notice. Friends looked at me with suspicion, their eyes flickering with unease, as if they sensed the darkness crawling beneath my skin. Isolation grew like a disease. The forest had not only claimed the children and the town, it had claimed me. And I was losing the war inside my own head. Yet somewhere, buried beneath the layers of fear and madness, a fragile spark of defiance remained. A whisper of myself that refused to be extinguished. But the forest's roots were deep. And it was patient. The town was no longer just a backdrop to my unraveling. It had become an active participant in my torment. A living, breathing entity shifting shape and meaning in ways I could neither control nor understand. It began one morning, thick mist swallowing the streets like a suffocating shroud. The fog rolled in suddenly, unnatural in its density, wrapping the town in a cold silence deeper than night. Even the birds were silent. It was as if the world had been muted, held hostage by some unseen force. I stepped outside, my breath a ghostly plume in the air. The mist curled around me like spectral fingers, cold and invasive. Shapes emerged, barely visible through the gray veil, tall, slender silhouettes standing motionless at the edges of my vision. The Watchers. They never moved, never blinked, never spoke. Just stood, always just beyond reach, their forms blurred and flickering like broken images on a cracked screen. Sometimes they seemed almost human, too tall, too thin, too still. Other times, their outlines twisted into impossible angles, their presence unnatural and deeply wrong. I tried to call out, to demand they leave me be. But my voice dissolved into the mist, swallowed by a silence so complete it was deafening. No one else saw them. No one else heard the faint rustle of their cloaks, the soft scrape of their unseen feet on pavement. With every passing day, their numbers grew. They multiplied in the mist. Standing outside my window, in the spaces between houses, lurking just beneath the cracked streetlights. They were always watching. Waiting. Their presence gnawed at the edges of my sanity like acid, eroding the fragile walls I'd built around my mind. I began to question everything. Were they real? Were they figments of my madness? Or something far worse, manifestations of the forest's hunger, stalking me beyond its borders? Sleep became impossible. The mist seeped into my dreams, transforming them into dark theaters of despair. The Watchers would appear on stage, silent, faceless judges with hollow eyes that bored into my soul. They pointed at me, accusing without words. I was trapped in their gaze, powerless, exposed. The townsfolk grew distant, their faces blank and unreadable. Conversations faltered when I mentioned the mist or the Watchers. Sometimes they'd glance nervously toward the fog, as if terrified to acknowledge the creeping horror. I realized then that the entire town was caught in the same slow decay, silent, complicit, or perhaps just as powerless. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the horizon, I saw them shift. One Watcher stepped forward, just a little more defined, a hand that ended not in fingers but twisted roots, a face cracked like ancient bark. It raised its gaze to meet mine, and in that gaze I saw the reflection of every lost child, every whispered secret, every shadow I had tried to outrun. Panic surged through me, a tidal wave of raw, primal fear. I ran blindly through the mist, the Watcher's silent footsteps echoing behind me, always just out of reach but never truly gone. When I collapsed, breathless, the forest's edge loomed ahead, an impossible boundary where reality fractured into 1,000 shards. The watchers faded into the fog, but their presence lingered, a choking weight on my chest. I knew then, the forest's hunger had a new form. It had reached beyond the trees, beyond the roots, and into the very fabric of the town. And I was the eye of the storm. The watchers weren't just observing. They were waiting for me to break completely, to step through the veil and join whatever nightmare pulsed beneath the earth. And with every breath, with every heartbeat, I felt that fracture grow deeper. The mist had become a veil between me and the world, a curtain of cold dread that warped every interaction, every glance, every whispered word. At first, the townsfolk had been distant but familiar, neighbors with tired eyes and cautious smiles, friends from years gone by. But as the watchers multiplied in the mist, something inside the town seemed to shift, a slow tightening of invisible threads pulling us apart. I tried to speak to Mara, the owner of the little bakery down the street, someone whose kindness had been a rare bond. I found her early one morning, arranging pastries behind the fogged glass. The mist curled like a living thing around her, clinging to her coat and hair. "Mara," I called softly. Her eyes flicked up, and for a heartbeat I thought she'd smile. But instead, she blinked rapidly, as if shaking off a haze, then forced a tight nod. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "The mist, it's not safe. People are watching." I nodded, desperate to hold on to the fragile connection, but the words felt hollow, like a script she'd been forced to memorize. When I pressed her for details, her gaze darted away, fixed on something beyond me. At the grocery store, old Mr. Harlan, whose gruffness was usually softened by a kind smile, barely acknowledged me. He handed over my change with shaking hands and muttered something about keeping to myself. The worst was the silence, thick, suffocating silence that filled rooms and streets alike. Conversation stopped when I entered. Eyes would flicker to the mist outside, then away, as if afraid to see me fully, or perhaps afraid I might see the truth in theirs. Even my closest friend, Lena, had changed. She no longer called or stopped by. When we crossed paths, she avoided my gaze, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. One evening, desperate for answers, I followed her from the diner where she worked. She slipped through the mist with hesitant steps, and I caught her meeting with a small group of townsfolk, faces lined with fear and whispered resolve. From the shadows, I heard snatches of conversation. "He's changed. The watchers, they see him. We can't let him fall." The words hit like ice in my veins. They weren't just afraid of the forest or the mist. They were afraid of me. It was then I realized the true nature of my isolation. The Watcher's presence had infected the town's very soul, twisting suspicion and fear into weapons aimed at me. I had become a living mark, an embodiment of the darkness creeping beneath the surface. I tried to confront Lena the next day, voice trembling with desperation. "Why are you afraid of me?" She stared, eyes glossy with unshed tears. "Because you're losing yourself. Because whatever's in that forest, it's inside you now." Her words weren't just accusations. They were warnings. And I knew deep down she was right. The boundaries between the townsfolk and me shrank, replaced by a growing chasm of dread and silence. Neighbors once friendly now crossed the street to avoid me. Doors closed softly but firmly in my face. The town wasn't just watching me, it was turning away. Every interaction, every cold glance, every whispered rumor was a reminder, I was no longer one of them. I was the outsider, the vessel of a creeping madness no one dared confront. And as the mist thickened outside, so did the suffocating loneliness within. The silence was deafening. Not the absence of sound, but the oppressive, suffocating quiet that followed every failed attempt at connection. The way the town recoiled from me like I was some contagious sickness, a living shadow no one dared approach. Each morning I awoke with a knot of dread tangled in my stomach, heavy and gnawing. The sun filtered weakly through the window, pale and cold, as if the world itself hesitated to shine on me. I found myself pacing the small rooms of my home, walls closing in with every step, searching for any whisper of familiarity or comfort. But there was none. Just the steady, unyielding pulse of my own thoughts, pounding in my skull. Memories twisted into nightmares. Faces from the town, once warm, now contorted with suspicion and fear. The way Mara's eyes darted away. Lena's whispered warning. The cold dismissal of Mr. Harlan. Every interaction a razor, slicing deeper into my fragile sense of self. I began to question everything. Was I truly losing my grip, or was the world around me crumbling? Was the mist and the watchers real, or a plague of my fractured mind? I spoke aloud to myself in the empty rooms, desperate for any voice but my own. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection, a haunted stranger staring back with hollow eyes, mouth moving in silent screams. Sleep became a battlefield. The watchers invaded my dreams with relentless persistence. Their hollow gazes pierced me even in darkness, accusing and indifferent. I would wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering, unable to shake the sensation that they stood just beyond my bed, waiting. Paranoia wrapped around me like a shroud. Every shadow, every creak in the house, every flicker of light became a signal, a sign that I was being watched, stalked, consumed. The lines between reality and delusion blurred until I no longer knew where I ended and the forest began. At times, I caught myself speaking to the mist, bargaining with the darkness, pleading for mercy or understanding. My hands trembled constantly, sometimes gripping the edges of tables until my knuckles bled. My reflection fractured in mirrors, multiplied like shards of a broken soul. Voices whispered behind closed doors, from empty corners, carried on the wind through cracked windows. They spoke in riddles, promises, threats. Sometimes I answered, other times I ran. I began to hear things. Low murmurs that slithered beneath my conscious mind. Names. Secrets. Warnings. The boundary between my thoughts and the forest's voice thinned until they were one and the same. Isolation became an obsession, a prison of the mind. I stopped going out, stopped reaching for the fragile threads of humanity. The town's rejection wasn't just external, it was an echo within, a reflection of the growing void inside me. And yet, beneath the despair, a fragile ember of defiance flickered. A desperate need to hold on to something real, something human, even as the darkness clawed closer. But the ember was fading. Because in this town, shrouded in mist and silence, the only certainty was the creeping cold of loneliness. The days bled into nights, and nights into days, time unraveling like a frayed thread slipping through my fingers. The world around me dimmed, colors fading to ash and shadow, voices muting into indistinct murmurs. I was becoming a ghost in my own life. I no longer trusted my senses. Sounds warped, footsteps echoing in empty halls, whispers curling around corners with no source. Light twisted, casting impossible shapes on the walls that writhed and recoiled as if alive. My reflection had fractured into something monstrous. Every glance in the mirror revealed a stranger's face, a cracked mask peeling away to expose hollows where my soul once lived. Sometimes, when the mist pressed hard against the windows, I swore those eyes blinked back with a sinister awareness. Sleep was a battleground I could never win. The watchers haunted my dreams, silent, faceless sentinels whose gaze burned through me. They shifted, multiplied, their forms stretching into grotesque parodies of human shape, and yet they never spoke. Their silence was a scream. Between dreams and waking, the boundary dissolved. I would catch glimpses of them in the corner of my vision, slender shadows slipping through the mist, fingers like gnarled roots reaching out, just beyond my grasp. The isolation wrapped tighter, suffocating. Even memories, once vivid and comforting, began to erode. Faces of those I loved blurred and twisted, Mara's worried eyes, Lena's desperate warnings, morphed into accusatory stares that pierced deeper than any knife. Voices crawled into my mind. Not words, but fragments. Echoes of conversations I hadn't had, warnings I couldn't decipher. They slithered beneath my thoughts like serpents, coiling and tightening their grip on my sanity. Sometimes, I caught myself speaking aloud, half-formed sentences and frantic pleas to shadows no one else could see. The walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, synchronized to my own, mocking and relentless. I stopped eating. Food tasted like ash, swallowed with mechanical detachment. My body weakened, but the fever in my mind only grew hotter, burning away reason and hope alike. Paranoia was no longer a warning but a constant state. I flinched at every noise, suspected every glance from the townsfolk as a calculated judgment. The mist outside was not just a weather pattern, it was a predator, alive and watching, waiting to swallow me whole. I became a prisoner of my own mind, trapped in an endless loop of fear and doubt. The boundaries between who I was and what the forest wanted from me crumbled until all that remained was a fractured reflection staring into the void. And in that void, the watchers waited. The mist was thicker than ever, a suffocating shroud pressing against my skin, seeping into my bones. It swallowed sound and light, turning the world into a muted, gray wasteland where shadows moved just beyond perception. I stood at the forest's edge, heart hammering like a desperate drum in my chest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting toward me like grasping fingers. Every instinct screamed to turn away, but something deeper. An unyielding, fractured shard of myself, pushed me forward. The ground beneath was damp and uneven, the scent of rot and earth heavy in the air. With each step, the mist seemed to pulse, alive with a rhythm that matched the erratic beating in my chest. The watchers were out here, I knew. Waiting. Watching. Feeding. My mind was a shattered mirror. Fragments of memories clashed with hallucinations. Lena's voice calling from the mist, Mara's terrified eyes, my own reflection breaking apart into countless faces, each screaming silently. Then I heard it, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the trees, like the world itself was breathing in slow, agonizing gasps. It was a sound that clawed at my sanity, threading through my skull with cold precision. I stumbled forward, drawn toward a clearing bathed in an unnatural pale light. There, the air shimmered with a sickly luminescence, and the ground was etched with twisted symbols, ancient and pulsing with dark intent. The watchers emerged from the mist, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and limbs that bent like brittle branches. They moved silently, surrounding me in a circle of unbearable stillness. Their gaze was not just watching, it was burrowing into me, peeling away layers of identity until nothing was left but raw, quivering terror. A voice, my own, yet not, whispered from the depths of my mind, "You are not alone." But I was alone. More alone than I had ever been. The watchers reached out, their fingers like twisted roots brushing my skin. Coldness spread through me, a numbing void that threatened to swallow the last shards of self. And yet, somewhere inside, a flicker resisted, a desperate will to hold on, to fight. I screamed, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of everything I had lost, everything I had become. The mist swirled violently, engulfing us in a cyclone of shadows and whispers. Reality fractured again, and for a moment, I glimpsed the true horror beneath, the endless cycle, the children, the forest's hunger. Then darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness was absolute, thick like a living thing pressing against my skin, squeezing the air from my lungs. The mist swallowed sound, light, even time itself, leaving only the slow pounding of my heart, sharp and uneven, a frantic echo in the void. When the blackness lifted, I was no longer standing on solid ground. Beneath my feet, the earth pulsed, alive and wet, like the beating heart of the forest itself. The air reeked of decay and something far fouler, rotting flesh and stagnant water mixed with the sickly sweet scent of crushed flowers, choking and cloying. Around me, the watchers' hollow eyes glimmered in the shadows, their forms twisting and stretching like the branches of a cursed tree. Their faces were faceless. Voids where eyes should have been, yet I felt their gaze burrow into my very bones. I tried to move, but my legs were heavy, bound by something unseen, tendrils of fog curling around my ankles like serpents tightening their grip. Panic surged, hot and sharp, burning through the cold numbness that had settled in my veins. Then came the whispers, low and guttural, a chorus of voices speaking in a language older than memory. They echoed from the trees, from beneath the ground, from inside my skull. Come. Become. Feed. Become. Join us. My mind fractured beneath the weight of their chant. Visions flooded me, children's faces twisted in terror, screaming as they vanished into the gaping maw of the forest. Hands reaching out from the earth, clawing and grasping. The cycle of disappearance and emergence, the endless sacrifice feeding something ancient and hungry. One watcher stepped forward, reaching out with a hand like cracked bark. When its fingers brushed my skin, I was ripped from the present, hurled into a nightmare vision. I was falling, endlessly falling through a void of screaming shadows and burning whispers. Faces, my own, twisted and broken, flew past me in a maddening swirl. The sky above was a roiling mass of black clouds, and beneath me yawned a pit of writhing roots and teeth. I landed hard on cold stone. Around me were symbols etched in blood and bone, a circle of grotesque sacrifice. The air shimmered with unbearable heat and the coppery scent of fresh blood. In the center of the circle lay a child, pale and still, eyes wide with frozen horror. The child's mouth was open in a silent scream, throat slit and bleeding into the earth. Around the body, the watchers knelt in silent reverence, their hollow eyes glowing with unholy light. My breath caught in my throat. The child's gaze seemed to pierce through me, a silent accusation burning into my soul. This was the true face of the forest's hunger, the price of the cycle. A terrible realization crashed over me, the child was me. Or rather, the version of me swallowed whole by the forest each year, replaced by a shadow that wandered through the mist, forgotten and alone. I screamed again, but the sound was swallowed, torn apart by the chanting voices and the relentless pulse of the forest's heartbeat. The watchers closed in, their fingers like claws scraping my skin, pulling me toward the altar. The ground beneath trembled, roots twisting and writhing like serpents ready to devour. And just as the darkness threatened to consume me, a fierce, raw part of my fractured self surged upward, rage and desperation boiling into a single, defiant scream. I broke free, shattered the invisible bonds, and ran. The forest roared behind me, a thunderous fury of branches and shadows reaching out to reclaim their prey. I stumbled through the mist, lungs burning, mind fracturing with every step. The town, the people, the cycle, it all blurred into a single horrifying truth: escape was a lie, and the forest's hunger was eternal. But I would not go quietly into that endless night. The forest had turned into a living nightmare, an endless, twisted labyrinth where every step dragged me deeper into madness. The mist clung to my skin like cold sweat, suffocating and unrelenting, thick enough to choke the breath from my lungs. My legs were burning, muscles screaming for relief, but I dared not stop. Behind me, the monstrous chorus of the watchers rose, a low, grinding sound that pulsed through the earth like the heartbeat of some ancient predator. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the mist, their forms flickering at the edge of my vision, never quite tangible, but always there. Branches clawed at my face and arms, sharp as broken glass, tearing at my skin. The forest floor was a treacherous mess of tangled roots and slick, decayed leaves that threatened to trip me into the darkness below. Each fall left me more raw, more desperate. The forest itself seemed alive with malice. The trees bent and twisted, their trunks groaning and creaking as if whispering wicked secrets. Shadows pooled beneath their gnarled limbs, shifting and writhing with unnatural shapes that lurched forward to grasp at me, vanishing whenever I dared to look directly. My breath came in ragged gasps. The air tasted foul, earthy and metallic, thick with rot and despair. Every inhalation burned my throat, searing the inside of my lungs like smoke. The whispers returned, soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. Then they grew, swirling around me in a cacophony of maddening sound. Names. Promises. Threats. You belong to us. You cannot run. We are your truth. I stumbled over a root and fell face first into the wet earth. The cold mud seeped into my clothes, soaking through, chilling me to the bone. My hands clawed at the ground, desperate for purchase, for something solid, anything to hold on to. When I looked up, the forest seemed to pulse with life. The trees shifted closer, branches stretching like fingers, closing the space around me. The mist thickened into a choking fog, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. I could hear it then, deep beneath the ground, a slow, pulsing thrum that echoed in my chest, a resonance that matched the growing pounding in my skull. It was the forest's heartbeat, alive and hungry, calling me home. The watchers were closer now, their forms clearer, twisted parodies of humanity. Their faces, if you could call them that, were smooth voids except for deep, hollow pits where eyes should have been, glowing faintly with unnatural light. One reached out, skeletal fingers grazing my shoulder, cold as the grave. My skin burned where it touched, as if freezing from the inside out. I screamed, wrenching free, but the terror had already taken root deep inside me. Panic twisted into something darker, an unbearable knowing that this was not just a chase, but a reclamation. The forest was not letting me go. It had already claimed pieces of me, memories, sanity, identity, and it wanted the rest. I pressed on, heart a wild drum in my chest, every nerve screaming for release, but the forest mocked my struggle. Paths looped back impossibly, the same twisted trees rising endlessly in every direction. It was a maze designed to trap souls, a prison built of shadow and rot. Hours, or was it days, passed in that suffocating gloom. Time lost meaning as exhaustion and fear gnawed away at the edges of my mind. Faces flickered at the edge of my vision, some familiar, some monstrous, all accusing, all lost. I screamed into the silence, but the forest only answered with a deeper, darker hunger. My sanity frayed, unraveling like the tattered clothes clinging to my trembling frame. I was nothing but a flickering candle in an endless storm, a broken mind tethered to a relentless, devouring darkness. And yet, amidst the crushing despair, a fragile spark refused to die, the raw, defiant ember of a soul screaming for freedom. Because even in this endless nightmare, I was still here. Still fighting. Still human. The forest pulsed around me like a living beast, every breath I took thick with rot and decay. The mist had thinned just enough to reveal the twisted grotesque altar at the center of the clearing. A monstrous fusion of gnarled roots, bones, and flesh, slick with wet, dark sap that glistened like blood in the dim light. The air vibrated with a terrible hunger, an ancient, primal force that seemed to seep into my bones, twisting my blood cold. My skin prickled with the feeling of countless unseen eyes boring into me, watchers, but something deeper, something older. I approached the altar, each step heavy with dread, the earth beneath my feet alive and writhing as if breathing. The ground pulsed like a heart, sickly and slow, and with every beat, it seemed to suck the breath from my lungs. A voice, not quite human, a rasping whisper like dead leaves scraping bone, echoed in my mind. You came. You belong. Join us. I collapsed to my knees, trembling, heart hammering against ribs that felt too fragile to hold it. The altar's flesh shifted and twitched, revealing the shape of a child trapped beneath layers of bark and sinew, limbs bound and eyes wide with eternal terror. Memories surged, crashing over me like tidal waves, the disappearances, the year-long imprisonments, the silent screams swallowed by the forest. The truth I'd tried to bury clawed its way into my consciousness. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a predator, a living hive that fed on children's souls, twisting them into these monstrous watchers. I tried to scream, but my voice caught, strangled by the crushing weight of horror. The watchers emerged from the shadows, circling me with their hollow faces glowing faintly in the dim light. Their touch was ice, crawling over my skin like a sickness. They whispered in unison, their voices a dreadful hymn, "Be one with the forest. Shed your flesh. Become eternal." My mind shattered as their claws tore into my thoughts, dragging me into visions of endless darkness, eternal captivity, and the slow erosion of self. But buried deep beneath the fear, a raw, primal rage flared. I clawed back through the nightmare, grabbing at threads of sanity like lifelines. I reached out, desperate, and grasped a shard of ancient bark from the altar, sharp, cold, pulsing with the forest's own cursed life. I plunged it into the heart of the writhing flesh. A scream tore through the clearing, a sound that was not quite human, not quite forest. The altar convulsed violently, sap and blood spraying like a geyser as roots writhed and snapped. The watchers recoiled, shrieking in fury, their hollow faces contorted in agony. The forest itself seemed to roar, a furious tempest of wind and shadow tearing through the trees. I stood, shaking but alive, the cursed shard still in my hand, its power burning through me like wildfire. The mist twisted, coiling like a serpent, and I saw them, faces of children trapped within the fog, their eyes pleading for release, their voices a ghostly chorus of pain. With every ounce of strength left, I screamed their names, calling to the lost souls, promising they wouldn't be forgotten. The forest trembled, and for a moment, the hunger faltered. But the watchers surged again, a wave of darkness threatening to swallow me whole. I braced for the final assault, knowing this battle was more than flesh, it was a war for my very soul. As the first claws closed around me, a blinding light exploded from the shard in my hand, tearing through shadow and bone. The last thing I saw was the forest screaming, alive, furious, and broken. The light ripped through the darkness like a blade, burning away shadow and silence. The watchers screamed, wails of agony that twisted and warped into something inhuman, reverberating through the forest's bones. I tumbled backward, the cursed shard clattering from my fingers, but the glow remained, a beacon piercing the choking mist. The trees shuddered violently, their bark splintering as if the forest itself was being torn apart from within. The ground cracked open beneath me, roots writhing like serpents desperate to reclaim their prey. But the light pushed outward, driving back the rot, the hunger, the endless cycle that had swallowed so many. I crawled away, breath ragged, lungs burning with cold air sharp as ice. The faces in the mist, the lost children, flickered briefly, their eyes filled with gratitude before fading into peace. The altar collapsed, flesh and bark dissolving into dust that scattered on the wind like ashes of a burned nightmare. But victory was a brittle thing. As the forest's roar faded into an uneasy silence, I felt something deep inside me shift, a hollow space where the light had burned away the darkness, but left scars that would never heal. I returned to the town, a place forever changed in my eyes. The streets felt colder, shadows deeper. The townsfolk avoided my gaze, whispering behind closed doors, their own fears reflected in my haunted expression. At night, the whispers returned, not from the forest, but from inside my mind. Faint echoes of the watcher's chant, the hunger clawing at the edges of sanity. I was free, yet still bound. Because some darkness does not die. It lingers, waiting, patient. And sometimes, it waits inside you. You think this story ended with the light. Broken, flickering, but victorious. You think the darkness was banished, buried beneath dust and silence. But some shadows never fade. There is a place where the forest breathes, where the lost children wait, and the watchers watch with hollow eyes that see not just your flesh, but your soul. If you ever hear a whisper on the wind, a soft call, a name you thought forgotten, do not answer. Do not follow the mist that creeps at the edge of your vision. Because once you step inside, the forest remembers. It remembers you. And it will never let go. Read this story at your own peril. Because some darkness does not rest in pages. It wakes. It watches. It waits. For you. The forest is patient. And it is hungry.